There's always hope beyond hopelessness. And it comes from living into these three conditions. First, you have to be willing. You have to want it yourself, for yourself. You have to be willing to go after it with everything you have, first and foremost in your life, before family, before work, before anything. You have to be willing to make that change. That's a hard one for people because they think that, well, how could I do anything before my family? How could I do anything before this? Well, let me just say this. If you are in a space of emotional suffering, you're not being the best you can be to your family. So focusing on healing yourself, that's the way you can be best for your family. You have to be vulnerable enough to be honest with yourself and another trusted person or more about your life, about what the situation is, about what the causes are, about what is plaguing you. That honesty is important. And then the final piece, which is also vitally important, is finding a trusted community. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Flow Over Fear podcast, where it is our mission to help you to rise above fear and realize your ultimate potential in leadership and life. I'm your host, Adam Hill, and it is my goal to share with you the human side of high performance. My guests share their experience with fear, anxiety, struggle, challenge, and most importantly, despite all of it, how they rose above it to achieve incredible results. So, if you're ready to rise up, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to Flow Over Fear. Thank you for being here today. And today I want to talk about some of the conditions of emotional healing. Now, there are really three relationships I think that we can have with fear. And generally speaking, I think that we can either be fighting it, we can be facing it, or we can be embracing it. And I talk a lot on this show in terms of finding that flow, finding that freedom beyond fear, about embracing fear. But how do we face it? How do we go from fighting it to facing it? Well, I believe that going from fighting to facing fear is an act of healing. That's where we go through an emotional healing that allows us to first transform our relationship with it. And the first time that happened with me was when I was getting sober. And, for many years, for despite the pain and the suffering that I was going through in alcoholism and with anxiety and fear in general, generally speaking, I was just not fully willing to commit myself to that healing process. The idea of letting go of an entire piece of myself, which was this Adam that was drinking heavily and, destroying his life really, that was still hard because I was still going to really not just let go of something that I felt was bad or evil. And yes, it was bad, but it was also letting go of a part of me. It was letting go of something that I grew up with, something that became a part of me. In the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, they call it's like we're like men who have lost our limbs. We never grow new ones. And that limb being, this person that we once were as alcoholics. I know it may sound weird to people who have not been through addiction or alcoholism, but it really does become a part of ourselves. It becomes a part of us. And there is a lot of fear of what happens on the other side of that, after that first death, because we're really letting go of a significant piece of what we are. But in that process of facing fear, you go and you heal and you become something new and something better. And it's definitely worth it. So if you are in that space of suffering, and then, I'll say that this episode is for you to help to kind of give some of those indications of those conditions that are required in order to, that I believe are required in order to have that emotional healing. And first, I want to give a bit of a disclaimer. I am not a PhD in emotional healing. I'm not. I am not a doctor. I have 0 letters after my name. So don't expect that this is going to be medical advice, because it's not. It's also not legal advice. It's not any kind of advice whatsoever. It's simply my experience and opinions on this subject as a friend of yours. and as someone who has seen this emotional healing enough in myself and others to know that there are certain conditions that seem to be happening in all of those cases. So I want to share some of those. So when in that decade while I was drinking, more than a decade, like 15 years in which I was drinking, I found that, I would try to go into Alcoholics Anonymous and get sober from time to time. And most of the time it was because somebody told me, dude, you need to get your shit together. Most often it was my wife who told me that I was ruining my life and all of that stuff. So I would go on, her behalf to go try to get into AA and go get sober. And as you can imagine, over time, once the heat came off, once the heat wore off, I would go back to my old habits, manipulate my way back into a drink, and then that would be my solution for my anxieties and fears once again. And I would once again lean into that relationship because that was the discomfort that I did know. And the discomfort that you do know is ultimately your comfort zone, even if it's uncomfortable. It's the discomfort that's outside of our comfort zone that we just don't like to lean into, but that will often help us to heal. And naturally, every time I went back out and drank, things got worse. Things got much worse, to the point where I was losing control. I was blacking out more often. I was getting in more trouble. I was feeling more terrible in times of sobriety. The hangovers got worse. The blackouts got worse. The anxiety and panic that I would feel in times of sobriety was much worse. And it wasn't until that I lost complete control over my life, a story of which many of you know if you've listened to this show or read my book, that when I lost complete control, I became a danger to not just myself, but to others. I got into a DUI accident, and that fortunately nobody was hurt in, but that's only by luck. And that was the thing that convinced me that, I was no longer, I was no longer a safe person in this world, that I could no longer keep other people safe from myself. And so at that point, that was my bottom. I had two choices. I could either end my life or go into recovery. And that's when I made the decision, thanks to, as I've talked about before, thanks to an intervention, in my opinion, of God's will in my life, nudging me in the direction of healing and away from murdering myself. I was able to walk into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and get the healing that I needed. And this is important. This is an important inflection point, a pivot point in my life too, because, and I want everybody to hear this clearly. When I was in that jail cell, I no longer thought that I deserved to be on this earth. Everything was hopeless for me. That was where my mind was. That's where my spirit was. That's where my heart was. Everything in me ached, so that it felt like nothing was worthwhile. That was as a result of fighting against fear, this natural human emotion that exists in all of us for a purpose. I was suppressing it, and now I felt hopeless, absolutely hopeless. But this glimmer, this door opening of hope was in the idea of getting healing. And I could tell you from my experience that walking into those rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I know now that there is hope beyond hopelessness because of those rooms of AA. There's always hope beyond hopelessness. And it comes from living into these three conditions. First, you have to be willing. You have to want it yourself, for yourself. You have to be willing to go after it with everything you have, first and foremost in your life, before family, before work, before anything. You have to be willing to make that change. That's a hard one for people, because they think that, well, how could I do anything before my family? How could I do anything before this? Well, let me just say this. If you are in a space of emotional suffering, you're not being the best you can be to your family. So focusing on healing yourself, that's the way you can be best for your family. Know that spending this time in healing will actually lead you to be more present for the things that you need to be present for. And then the second thing is honesty and vulnerability. You have to be vulnerable enough to be honest with yourself and another trusted person or more about your life, about what the situation is, about what the causes are, about what is plaguing you. That honesty is important. And then the final piece, which is also vitally important, is finding a trusted community of support. For me, it was Alcoholics Anonymous, but there are trusted communities everywhere for any sorts of things that you can think of. And for most of those things, there are ways in which you can lean into that community and get the support you need. Those are the conditions, the three conditions I think that are essential for emotional healing. So going back to the willingness piece, that willingness piece is that first step of facing fear. You have to want it. And that facing fear, and the reason that this is the path of rising above fear is because it's a first act of courage. Think about when you're running away from something. If you're running from something, whether it be a monster you think exists or, something, whatever it may be, whatever monster may be chasing you, think about yourself stopping in your tracks because you're so exhausted. You're so tired of running. You're so worn out. You just can't do it anymore. And surrendering to the idea that I'm just going to turn around and face it. This isn't rolling over and dying. This is turning around, looking that fear right in the eye, facing it, and saying, I acknowledge you. You're there. You're present. Now, fear's purpose is to scare you. So if you turn around and look at it and name it, and you face it face to face, you're taking its power away from it. Now you're looking at it and you're looking at it for what it really is. You're at the same level of it. You're acknowledging that it's there, you're naming it, and that can give you some peace. And when you do that, that's where you can start to see these elements of what can happen. And at that point, when you're looking at your fears face to face, that's when the second piece comes in. You could start to get honest and vulnerable about it. You have the willingness, you have the willingness to turn around, face your fear. Now you can start to get honest and vulnerable about it. And this is the important part about taking that courage to the next level, is that you could start to categorize your fears or that fear that's bothering you and start to find a solution to it. Start to find a way to rise above it. For me, when I started in Alcoholics Anonymous, I went through, the first 4 steps of AA, and the fourth step was a 4th step inventory. It's where we take a deep dive into our moral inventory and what our fears are and things like that. And my sponsor put a piece of paper in front of me that had the word fears written in big bold letters over the top of it, and he wanted me to write down all of the fears that I had in my life, from big to small, from, the fear of spiders to the fear of confrontation to, all of the fears that I had in my life. And I did what I was told, and I wrote out all, 100 or so fears that I had that I could think of. And there was something amazing that happened in that. As I wrote those down, as I named them, as I shared them with someone I trusted, my sponsor, I found that it gave me some peace. I was able to look at these and say, okay, some of the fears were those ridiculous fears, like the fear of spiders, but some of them were plaguing me. Like I had a fear of rejection. I was a people pleaser. I still am to some degree. And I had a fear of failure. I had a fear of looking like a fraud. And when I named these, one thing I recognized as I went through this list, and this was another important aspect of writing down and naming those fears. A, takes the power away from the fear. It gives you some peace. And then finally, it actually allows you to categorize them, to see them in an organized list, takes that rat's nest of fears that are rattling around in your brain for so long, and it just organizes them. And what I found on this list was that there were really three primary fears that existed, that were the root causes of all of these 100 or so fears. Three root causes. And those root causes were uncertainty, overwhelm, and self-doubt. And I've shared a little bit about this in the past. I've shared about these three root causes of fear. These are different from danger fears, by the way, because danger fears are those fears that we have that we're legitimately in danger. Like, we should probably be afraid of a 100-foot wave that is in front of us. And we should probably run away from it, even though people like Larry Hamilton might paddle into it, but there's a healthy fear of danger that would say, let's get away from this, or that prevents us from jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. Those are healthy fears of danger that we should have. But aside from that, there are three non-danger fears. I call them opportunity fears, because what they do is they signal this opportunity that exists that is just beyond our comfort zone. Uncertainty, overwhelm, and self-doubt. And when I named those, it actually took the fear away from it. And there's one other thing about that honesty and vulnerability piece. When we start to be vulnerable and honest, that is when we start to find God. And I know a lot of people might take issue with that, but I've talked before about the idea that a higher power is so vitally important, and it is a crucial part. It's step one and step two, or step two and step three of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In any 12-step program came to believe that a higher power exists that can lead us to sanity, a higher power that loves us. And that is true of any healing process, is finding that there is a higher power. Because if we're suffering, if we're subjugated, if we're in any form of suffering, whether it be mental, psychological, or physical, there is a higher power that is being imposed upon it. There's no debate about that. Alcohol was my higher power. Drugs can be a person's higher power. Imprisonment can be somebody else's higher power. But there is a higher power that can lead us to sanity. So admitting now that we do have the capability to have something that is in control of us, that we lose control, that we have a higher power, is it that hard to think that there is a higher universal power out there, a God that can lead us to sanity, that can help us to heal? Getting honest and vulnerable helps lead us to that higher power. And it helps us to lead us to God, because that honesty and vulnerability is where we start to seek the truth. When we get honest with ourselves, we start to seek the truth. So I would invite anybody that may be listening to this, that if you're in that mode of healing and you're struggling with the God concept, the idea of the higher power, I get it. And I don't want to alienate people. And I'm not asking you to believe in this God or that God or anything like that. But I am asking you to get curious. Just get curious. Don't entrench yourselves in the beliefs of what you have, that there is no God or no anything. Because then you're just being as stubborn as those that say there is definitively this God. Instead, be curious and seek truth for yourself. And that's what'll lead you to your higher power. And the final piece of that's a condition for emotional healing is that trusted community. And this is also a very spiritual component, because when you find that community, you amplify the healing that can happen. You amplify it, because even in the Bible, it says that where there are two or more gathered among us, there he exists in our midst. So there's an encouragement, even from a spiritual perspective, to join a community, a like-minded community of support and encouragement, something that's supportive, something that's trusted. It's so vitally important. It's something that I neglected when I tried to get sober previously. Yes, I walked into the rooms of AA, but did I engage in those communities? No, because I always felt that they were different from me. I didn't focus on the similarities, because they had bottles of Jack Daniels under their bed. I didn't do that. They rode motorcycles and had goatees. I didn't have that. They went to prison before. I didn't go to prison. I'm not one of them. But we all had this in common. We drank like without control. So that was the trusted community, is find the similarity in the thing that you want to heal from. And then you find that the personality differences that exist aren't so different after all when you have that common thing that you're healing from. This is something that I believe personally, you may challenge me on this, but I believe that this is something that the whole world can benefit from, is when we find community, even with those that we might disagree with to the biggest extent. If we can find that common area where we want to heal and work together on it, we can become best friends, brothers and sisters, spiritually connected, soulmates. That's where it happens. When you find that commonality, that one common thread that you're healing from. I mean, just think of all of the pain and suffering that we have in the world. If we could find that common theme and start healing through it, we could do that. And with whatever it is for you, if it's alcoholism, if it's addiction, if it's eating disorders, anything of that kind, that trusted community is important. And let me define what is part of that trusted community, because that can mean a lot of things. This doesn't just mean a group of friends. Now, the trusted community has to have a certain components to it. And this is true not only in healing, but in personal development. It has to have a mentorship aspect, meaning there has to be people in that community that have been through the ringer and have gone through the healing process and have come out the other side and are essentially have been in treatment, in recovery for a long time, or are healed. And that they can mentor you through the process, or mentor newer people to that program through the process. It's a mentorship program. So there has to be those people that have the experience, that apprenticeship model. That's where sponsorship comes into AA. And I know that sounds scary to a lot of people, but it's so vital. It works in Alcoholics Anonymous, it works in real estate investing, and it works in all sorts of other ways. But that mentorship model is important. And then the other piece is that fellowship piece, the fellowship of having people that may be going through the same experience you are at the same time. So you have that fellowship. Those two elements coming together means that you're healing together. You're lifting each other up through this process, and you have the mentorship to help too. This is not just how AA works, but it's how a lot of masterminds work. So you think about how those communities work to level us up. Any transformation that you're going to make, whether it be a healing transformation or a personal growth transformation, requires that we lean into the right trusted community for that support and that help, and that have mentorship and fellowship. So look for those kinds of things. And if we can go through this process, if we have those three conditions, and those aren't, there may be more depending on what you're going through. I'm not going to pretend to be the be all end all authority of emotional healing, because everybody's situation is different. And it is equally challenging. And I'm not saying that embracing these three elements is going to make it easy. It is not going to be easy. It is not easy to heal, but it's worth it. And it's possible. And that, if you're in a place of suffering right now, you need to know that it is possible, that the suffering doesn't need to continue, that emotional healing can happen. And you can move beyond and rise above the trauma. If you have the willingness, the honesty and vulnerability, and you find a trusted community. Those are the basic three things that you need, conditions that you need for emotional healing to happen. And, I'd also encourage within that trusted community, sometimes that mentorship can be a therapist. I've been with a therapist for well over 12 years now, and it's been a great relationship. It was very helpful for me to help with that emotional healing. It continues to help now as I continue to heal, because healing is an ongoing process. Even when we personally grow, there's always things that we can heal from. But the beauty is that once you do it once, or once you go through that process, the iterations become more doable. You can do them again, regardless of what you face. You become stronger. You become more courageous. You expand your comfort zone, and then you can begin to develop personally on a personal level. So face that fear. Stop running from it. Stop fighting from whatever you may be suffering from. Turn around and face it. Rise up and face it. Face the fear is your first act of courage. With willingness, with vulnerability and honesty, find that trusted community. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Flow Over Fear podcast. If you'd like to learn more about getting into flow and learn the foundations of flow, I have a free video series on my website at www.adamcliffordhill.com called The Foundations of Flow. Feel free to go there and download it and start your journey to rising above fear and achieving greater flow in your life. And if you like this episode, and I'm guessing you did if you stuck around for this long, then please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, and you will receive notifications when I have new interviews, new recaps, and new trainings that pop up on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us.